Well, greetings. My name is Kate Rademacher, and I'm delighted to be here with author and pastor Mark Feldmeir. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I've read a previous book of Mark's, which I really, really enjoyed, and am now looking forward to receiving a copy of his newest book, Life After God, Finding Faith When You Can't Believe Anymore. And Mark is a longtime friend of Brian Elaine, the founder of Writing for Life, and How to Heal Our Divides. And I know that he's been a source of real inspiration to Brian. And I'm looking forward so much to this conversation. So thank you so much, Mark, for being here.
Mm.
Can you tell us a little bit about your backstory? How did you get to be, what you are today? How are you? I know you're a pastor, right? And an author of multiple books. So just tell us a little bit about that backstory, and particularly how did you get into writing books?
Yeah.
Because of course many of our listeners are keenly interested in writing. And then tell us about your new book. Tell us just more about the premise and how you came to write it. And again, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Kate. It's great to be with you and appreciate being on your program. I I'm currently lead pastor at a church just outside of Denver, United Methodist Church called St. Andrew, and it's a large church, one of the largest churches in the Methodist churches in the Western U.S. and a really important anchor in our denomination for a more open, inclusive, progressive voice that is currently speaking into what is sort of a more divisive season in the United Methodist Church. And so I am really grateful. I've been here 9 years. And prior to that, I was coming from Southern California, where I grew up. I was born and raised there and went to school there. I went to school at Claremont School of Theology, and then served a couple of churches in the Southern California area, one in Orange County, California, for 12 years. That was a new church plant. And then 9 years in a church, more well-established church in San Diego. So two churches that I served over about 20 years before coming to the Denver area and serving here. So that's sort of my vocational journey. I was, interestingly enough, I was raised Catholic up until my mid-teens, and I know for many that has mixed emotions around it. For me, it was a very positive experience, and really fed my spiritual imagination, and I suppose formed me spiritually in ways that that are receptive to mystery and depth. And so I'm grateful for that journey I took to get here. My newest book is Life After God. The subtitle is Finding Faith When You Can't Believe Anymore. And the book emerged out of what originated as a sermon series here at St. Andrew a couple of years ago. And it seemed to have resonated with a large number of people, both locally. We at St. Andrew, we have quite a following outside of our local community online. And the more feedback I got from folks about the themes that we were talking about in the sermon series, it struck me that it was worthy of sort of further writing and perhaps a book. And so
Mm.
shopped it
Oh,
with some
that's great.
publishers, and here we are today. So yeah.
Oh, cool. That's awesome. Well, tell us more about just for those. Full disclosure, I was so excited to get this interview on the books, but I haven't had a chance to read the book yet. So just tell us more about how it's structured and kind of the key themes that you explore.
Yeah, the book is really addressed to an audience of readers who are struggling still with either a more evangelical based religion and upbringing, and or those that maybe grew up in the mainline church but have grown discouraged by the seeming lack of relevance to their ordinary lives and their real lived experiences. So it's really intended for folks either who maybe have gone through some spiritual religious trauma and have been told that they can't ask questions and that they can't engage the paradoxes of faith. And also, again, those more liberal minded folks who, I guess, to use a phrase, to sort of have squeegeed out the joy and wonder of faith and reduced it to reason or in some cases, for many people, they've reached a place where it's just not believable anymore. So I try to restructure. There's a whole movement happening in our culture right now around Christianity called deconstruction, and people are deconstructing and finding some liberation through that process. This is about deconstruction, but it is matched with, I think, equally with a more constructive and more generative approach to maybe how to reimagine God in ways that we haven't had a chance or been given permission to imagine God. And so some of the themes are around just the very nature of God, so questions about the omnipotence of God. That's a big doctrine for people. This idea that God is all powerful, and that conflicts for many people with the issue of whether God can be all loving too, because in a world of tragedy and suffering, how do we justify the love of God and the all powerful nature of God when bad things happen? And why doesn't then God intervene to save those out of love? So the book sort of begins with that paradox and the conflict, and then goes into questions around does God really know our future in full? That's another, we would call that omniscience in Christian orthodoxy, that God knows everything that has happened, that is happening, and that will happen all at once. And I challenge that notion. Um, so questions about salvation, really, what is salvation? What was meant by salvation when Jesus preached about it? And to try to reorder salvation, not just as some personal phenomenon, but a social one as well, and even primarily one that's deeply social and political and economic and these kinds of things. So questions about heaven and hell and what happens ultimately when we die, and have we really embraced a genuine understanding as people of faith that's more biblical than, say, the more popular notions of heaven and hell that we might find in the Left Behind series of the 90s. And so trying to help people, as I say in the book, find the God that they never perhaps met because there was a different kind of God that they were told about that got in the way, and introducing people, readers, to a more generous and a more deeply biblical God that we find in Christian and Hebrew scriptures.
Well, thank you. And I really appreciate that overview. And, I just want to go back to something you said several minutes ago was about those who are deconstructing in the US. And, that's, of course, a very active conversation that's happening on social media and with a lot of people I've spoken to in the last 9 months as I've been engaged in the transition with Brian Elaine and Compassionate Christianity and Writing for Your Life. Um, I've been hearing from a lot of people who are somewhere along the journey of deconstruction, and it's very painful for a lot of people and confusing, and not just confusing because there's a theological question or a sort of uncertainty about the future, but I think I sense in people a deep grief because
Yeah.
there's sort of a loss of innocence. And so I'm curious, is your book kind of a pastoral voice? Is it kind of more of a sort of for those who need a bolster of like theology or a new path of theology? Is it sort of, I guess, more intellectual? That's, or sort of, so again, for someone who maybe hasn't encountered your writing before, can you just sort of give us a taste of that style? Thanks.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, I think it's all of those characteristics. But it is primarily what, so far, some of the reviews that I've had, it's primarily conversational. And so I begin from a place of more of a pastoral context. I am a pastor. That's my calling and my full-time vocation. And I live in this space where people almost on a daily basis are asking me questions either about their doubts and their fears about what happens when they doubt and they let go of some of these old doctrines that don't work anymore, or and as you named it, that grief that comes with that, it's so heavy, and the shame. And so my whole first chapter, the title is is all my titles for each chapter are sounds, and the first sound for chapter one is the sound of shh, which is the voice of both our institution. It's the voice that we hear in our conscience. It's the voice that we hear from those that love us, that can't believe that we're pushing ourselves away from these more harmful doctrines that we've been holding on too long. And so I get a lot of that. I get also folks that maybe are toward the end of their life, and uh, they have kids or grandkids that used to go to church, and they but no longer do, and the grief of not being able to have the words to have conversations about where they're at in their lives. And one of my arguments in the book is that the current young generation, Gen Z and millennials, are probably more deeply spiritual than any previous generation on the planet, or at
Wow.
least certainly in America. But but they don't approach their spirituality primarily through the lens of organized religion and Christianity in particular. And
Mhm.
they're finding God and wonder and mystery out there beyond the walls of the church. I for 2 years in a row, the 2 summers in a row, I've walked the Camino de Santiago in Spain, and the
Wow.
number of people I've encountered on that journey who are seeking a spiritual experience, but not naming it necessarily as a God sort of search, is it's interesting and astonishing. And so, how do we find a way to have conversations with those that are seeking outside the, I guess, the bounds of organized orthodoxy, and that's what this book is about. Yeah, yeah.
Wow. Well, that sounds so needed. And as you and I were discussing just briefly before we started recording, I think I and many of us are concerned about the divisiveness in our culture in the United States and our um, democracy. And, there's just a lot to be concerned about. And so, this is maybe, where do you feel like this book fits in that conversation? Like, who are you speaking to more broadly? And what do you guess where do you hope this lands in the conversation, and who do you think that this will help? Meaning, how can we heal our divides, to coin a phrase from Brian? How can we, and for those folks who are in that sort of place that you described, where they're sort of unsteady on their feet in terms of their faith life, um, and they're sort of also perhaps grappling with their kind of political and social lives, and sort of everything feels up in the air. How do you respond to those, or how does this book help those respond to that need, I think?
I think you're naming um, something that's so important, especially for those that hold faith as central to their understanding of who they are in the world, and that is this concept is an ancient, really ancient concept that suggests that um, we become that which we worship. I think that's a paraphrase of Saint Francis of Assisi. There are others mystics who along the way have paraphrased that in different ways, but we become that which we adore or worship. So that if our understanding of the God that we worship is a God who's all powerful, a God who, by all powerful, I mean primarily a God who works coercively in the world and unilaterally in the world, making things happen even against our will. Um, if this is our notion of God, we will in the world become just like that God in our own behaviors. I think when we look at the world today and we see the craziness and the mess that we're in, it's in large part because we have very disfigured images of God, and those either need to be healed or they need to be replaced. And so, just on the issue of the nature of God's power, I argue in the book that God is primarily not a God that is defined by coercive unilateral power, but one that is defined by persuasive power. That God doesn't actually have the power to make any of us do anything, but that God's power is is held in this constant beckoning or invitation or lure, if you will, toward action. And that is the nature of God's power, one of calling us toward becoming a better version of ourselves and making a better version of our world. So, so you could apply this same conversation to pretty much every chapter in the book. For example, if we think that God is going to rapture us out of this world at some point, as many more evangelical Christians do, well, that gives us permission to just ignore the deep needs of this world right now, especially the growing ecological crisis, to say it doesn't matter because we have this divine evacuation plan set up. And then if we're so-called saved, we have this divine sort of life insurance policy. We don't need to change the world. We don't need to improve it or work for it because we're not going to be here. So in the book, I argue quite the opposite, that the rapture is a commercialized concept that made a couple of authors a lot of money, and yet it's not biblical. And the biblical vision of the end of time is one not of destruction, but one of completion and unity, in which God's will on earth is fully realized. So again, how we understand God and how we understand God's action in the world, I think in large part determines how we're going to act in the world and how we understand our authority and power.
Well, thank you so much for that. And I'm just so excited for this book to make its way into the world because I just think really so many people need to have this conversation and will benefit from it. So thank you for your words. And my final question that I might ask you about your House Divided book if we have time, but how um how do you feel like this book can help families? Meaning intergenerational conversations. So, I live in a family where with incredible religious diversity. I have, I'm seeking ordination in the Episcopal Church. I heard, I have a father who's Catholic. I have a mother who's Unitarian Universalist. I have a husband who's Buddhist. So, there's a lot of diversity. I have cousins and uncles who are Mormon. So, there just is such great diversity in our families, in our country, in our communities. And I sense that there's something really powerful in your book that can even help with those discussions between sort of people who just have really different understandings of God. Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah, I think it's probably sadly much easier for people outside the Christian tradition to have interreligious dialogue than it is for people who are in the Christian tradition trying to have that same dialogue with those outside. Um, the book assumes that certainty is the greatest barrier to not only our own internal transformation, but the transformation of the world. That when we are so certain about our beliefs and our dogmatic positions, that will immediately interfere with any more generous and welcoming kind of conversations with people of other faiths. And so, this book, in some of the podcasts I've done with people on interviews, I've heard a number of times people have said, "Man, this book is gonna really tick people off. Um, it's gonna really make people angry." And my response is, yeah, it probably half the people that read it will be challenged by it, and I am writing for them. I'm also writing especially for the other half, those people whose voices have been silenced, their questions have been shamed, and to give them a voice through the book that says you can actually lead with questions and lead with curiosity. And so, I guess back to your question, I think the surrendering our certainty and embracing curiosity is probably fundamental not only to this book but my previous book, A House Divided. Yeah.
Well, I love that, and I love that word, curiosity. So since it sounds like you're up for it, just one question about your book, A House Divided. The subtitle of that book, if I have it right, is Engaging the Issues Through a Politics of Compassion. And as you know from my own work with Brian and Compassionate Christianity, that word really resonates with me. So can you just talk a little bit about what is it? What do you mean by a politics of compassion, and how might we put that into place in our divided and difficult times? Thanks.
I think Christians in particular could do well to reclaim the word compassion. Love is a more generalized term. Compassion is a very specific term that I think describes it more fully, and specifically the kind of work that people of faith do in the world. The Greek word for compassion is, in some forms, splagnizomai. It's a big mouthful of letters, but splagnizomai really refers to, at the heart of that word is splankna, which refers to the belly and actually to the spleen itself. And so to have compassion is to be moved in your gut. And that's a different place than where most of us operate from our minds. And we think that we assume that we can think our way through issues. And when we meet each other at a place of compassion, that shared place in our gut that says, I hurt for you, I feel for you. I may not understand you, but I've been through what you're going through. I know a little bit about your journey because I feel it, or I have felt it in my past. So that's, and we today we say, we talk about butterflies in our stomach, or we see a tragedy and our stomach turns in knots. These are phrases that we've inherited, I think, that originate from this idea of compassion, like that is rooted in the belly, and that we truly feel what others feel. I think when we have hard conversations about politics over the dinner table, or wherever we are, that if we begin from that place of the belly and the gut, and see the humanity in the other, that's at least a good place to start. It's a lot easier to do that than to use our brains and to immediately otherize, which we often do.
Well, thank you for that. And that really resonates. And one thing regarding, coming from the belly, as you were describing, is that I think that that requires us to slow down.
Mm.
And, we're just getting to know each other through these conversations. And so my most recent book was called Reclaiming Rest. And I just really, it's about a Sabbath ethic of life, but really what I've come to realize in my own life and talking to lots of people about the problem of burnout and is that we just need to slow down, and that the pace of our lives is just really fast. And so I'm in a season of my life when I'm trying to slow down and listen to and literally, listen to my body more, including where it's
Yeah.
hurting. And so I think that that sort of framing of compassion is really useful, and I'm grateful for that. So again, let's turn back to your book that you're just releasing. Tell us where we can get it and when it's available, and if you can show us the cover. I'm not sure if you held it up yet. Um, and where can we find out about more about you and your work? Thank you. Beautiful. And do you have a website? All that good stuff. Are you on social media? Are you live tweeting or live? What do we say now?
Yeah, the easiest way to find me is at markfeldmeir.com, my personal website. People can also find me at the St. Andrew United Methodist Church website. That's gostandrew.com. And a lot of my recordings of sermons and messages are there. I'm on social media, all the platforms. You could find me at Twitter and Threads now. And I guess it's not Twitter, it's X, and Facebook. And so I'm out there, pretty easy to find. A simple Google will produce probably enough. So, yeah. And the book is published by Westminster John Knox Press. It came out about 3 weeks ago, in August.
Awesome. Well, I know my book copy is in the mail, literally, so I'm so excited, and I will ask you to sign it for me.
Yeah.
Hopefully, we'll be together at some point in the foreseeable future, so I'll ask you to sign it for me. And in the meantime, maybe you can just hold it up again, just to say blessings on this book launch, and just to thank you for your words. I really feel like you have um, a pastoral voice and a prophetic message. Maybe that's how I would put it. So thank you so much, and congratulations. And do you have any final things you want to share before we wrap up?
Oh, that's great. It's a real honor to be a part of your show here and to talk with you and get to know you. So thank
All right.
you.
Well, thank you so, so much.